All right. I'm going to do today's in two separate videos. So the first one is going to be going through the lecture, and then I will do a separate video for the scientific notation math review. So yesterday we kind of briefly covered irrigation. I'm sorry, I was trying to rush to make sure we could get the lab set up, but it just didn't work out for us. So we will go through this a little more today, and then we will also go into 5.6 talking about pesticides. So we briefly talked about the different types of irrigation. You have furrow, which is like long ditches that fill with water. Drip irrigation, which is very efficient but expensive. It has the little holes in the hose to allow water to drip out. Farmers can turn it on and off when they need to. Flood irrigation is flooding the entire field, but it can be really bad for plants because it can waterlog them. And then spray irrigation. Remember, this is what we said. You see a lot of them on I-49. This is when the groundwater is pumped into these big spray nozzles, and it's pretty efficient but expensive. So waterlogging. When we talked about the flood irrigation can cause waterlogging, and that is basically when it saturates the soil and fills all of those soil pore spaces with water. And this doesn't allow air to get down into the soil, so roots can't get any oxygen. And this will eventually stunt the growth or kill crops. But there is a positive. You can add some drip irrigation or soil aeration, which is just poking holes into the soil to allow air to get in there and drain. But you do have to change some things about it. You can't just do complete flood irrigation. You have to make some changes for it to be efficient. And then soil salinization, this is what we talked about yesterday, and this is the lab that we are going to work on. So this is the process of salt building up in soil over time. All of the groundwater that is used for irrigation naturally has small amounts of salt. If you have a well at your house and you have well water, naturally there are minerals in that water, and salt is usually in there. And so when this water evaporates, it leaves all of that salt behind on the soil, and over time that builds up and can reach dangerous levels for the plants and prevent their growth. So the solution is to swap to a drip irrigation or do some soil aeration where you get some of those holes in the soil to allow oxygen in there. Or you can flush your field with fresh water or swap to a freshwater source. But of course, not everybody has access to swap to a freshwater source. And then global water use. Surprisingly, industrial is only 19% of the global water use, and this is what actually is used in power plants, metal and plastic manufacturing, all of those big plants that make anything. They only use about 19% of the water. Households, your small businesses, things like that for drinking water, toilets, taking baths, all of that is considered municipal, and it is only 11%. The biggest user of our water is actually agriculture, and that is water that they give to the cows, horses, chickens, and irrigation for the crops. Of course, you can imagine that irrigation does take a lot of water. You see how big those fields are. Each plant needs water. So that is a very, very big user of our water at about 70%. All right, aquifers and groundwater. Groundwater is water stored in the pore space of permeable rock and sediment layers. And then aquifers are your usable groundwater deposits for humans. So you can see these are your aquifers. It's basically open spaces under the ground that store water. And if you have well water, yours comes from an aquifer. But the difference here between these two, this one is considered confined because it doesn't have like an opening space with running water going through it. The way that water gets into this aquifer is it has to travel through the soil and get down in there. This one is considered unconfined because it has an opening. You see this stream right here actually flows down into this aquifer. So it has an opening where water just constantly flows in it. And then replenished by groundwater recharge, which is this right here where I said how this confined aquifer, it has to travel through the soil before it can get into that aquifer. There's no opening. So that's called groundwater recharge. And that's when the water goes through the soil and down into that aquifer. Now, the difference between these two, unconfined aquifers are naturally going to recharge or replenish a lot quicker because they have this opening with water constantly flowing into it. And then confined aquifers recharge over a longer term and recharge a lot more slowly. So sometimes, I mean, you can basically run a well dry. If you're using water a lot quicker than it can recharge, you got to think it takes a long time for that water to flow through the soil and get down into that aquifer. And if it's not raining a lot and recharging that aquifer and you're using a lot of water, you can run the well dry. And then depletion of aquifers, saltwater intrusion. This happens when you have excess pumping near the coast and it lowers your water table pressure and it allows all of this salt water to seep up into the groundwater. And then you have something called a cone of depression, and this forms when the water table is lowered by excessive pumping, depleting water, and drying nearby wells. So you can actually shut other people's wells off by pumping too much of the water because see this barn for agriculture use right here. They had a deep well, started off like this. Everybody had access to the water. The houses didn't have as deep of wells, but eventually this farm is using lots and lots of water. So as the top of this aquifer starts to lower, it gets what we call a cone of depression. And so this well is still reaching water and they think they're doing good, but they have a really deep well. And what they don't realize is that they have depleted this aquifer enough that it has actually turned these household wells dry because they've pumped so much of the water out that these short wells cannot reach it anymore. Okay, so a practice FRQ would be to describe how soil salinization occurs. So remember, we talked about how groundwater naturally has some salt in it. So how does that make the soil saltier over time? And then propose a solution to prevent or remediate the soil salinization and identify a disadvantage of the solution you propose. So in the slides, when we talked about some solutions, a lot of them are expensive. That could be a disadvantage, or the fact that some farmers can't get access to fresh water to change their well over to fresh water, or not well, but to change their irrigation to fresh water. All right, and then moving into 5.6, pest control methods. So here's the objective, and then okay, so pesticides are basically chemicals that are considered toxic to pests. And so pesticide is basically your overall umbrella word, and then you have different chemicals that fall under the category of pesticides. And so you have something called a rodenticide, which is obviously used to kill rodents. Fungicides kill fungi. Insecticides kill insects, and herbicides kill plants. So a lot of people get confused between a pesticide and an herbicide. Pesticide is just used to kill pests in general. Herbicide is specific for killing plants, so weeds. Roundup is considered an herbicide because it kills plants, weeds. So pesticides can cause pests to become resistant to pesticide with overuse. So just like antibiotic resistance, remember we talked about how the overuse of antibiotics can cause bacteria to be resistant to medicines. Same thing can happen with pesticides. So genetic diversity gives some pest resistant traits to pesticides, just kind of like people. Some people naturally have stronger immunity to colds or things like that. Plants are the same way. Some naturally have some traits that are resistant to pests. And so pesticides artificially select for pests with resistance by killing all of the non-resistant individuals and leaving only the resistant ones. So if you're constantly using Roundup in your yard, it's working good for a while, but you do have some weeds that Roundup won't kill. And so those weeds are resistant to the pesticide. And over time, you keep using Roundup and you've killed off all of the plants that are able to be killed by Roundup. And eventually, you're only going to be left with these resistant weeds, the weeds that won't be killed by Roundup. So now you've kind of created a bigger problem because these weeds are going to keep growing and spreading, and you can't kill them with Roundup because they're resistant now. And then, so GMOs, remember we talked about the genetically modified organisms. GMOs can be used to make plants resistant to certain pests. So a gene for pest resistant trait is added to the plant through genetic modification. In the corn plants, they actually have a bacteria that comes from soil that produces crystals to be toxic to pests. So they have inserted that gene from the bacteria into this corn so that now you don't have to spray it with pesticides or herbicides because it's naturally resistant on its own. Roundup Ready crops are genetically modified to be resistant to broad herbicide Roundup, meaning that Roundup will kill the weeds but not the crops. So we have genetically modified, let's use these corn plants for an example. We've genetically modified these corn plants so that they will not be killed by Roundup. A farmer can go through his field and spray Roundup to get rid of all of the weeds, but it will not kill the corn plants because we have inserted that gene to make it resistant to Roundup. So GMOs and pesticide use. Roundup Ready crops have increased herbicide use since crops can't be harmed by it. So before, when using Roundup on corn plants would actually kill the corn, farmers didn't use a lot of it. And if they did, they were very careful with how much they used and where they actually sprayed it because it was going to kill their crop as well. But since now that corn is not killed by the Roundup, farmers use it and just spray the whole field with it. So of course it has increased the use. And then this BT corn has decreased insecticide use since corn makes its own insecticide now. So remember when I said that they inserted the corn plant with the gene from the bacteria that is resistant to insects. So it's kind of a, I don't want to say darned if you do, darned if you don't, because the genetically modified for resistant to Roundup is good for the corn plants, but it has increased our use of herbicides. But the genetically modified corn for insects has decreased insecticide use. So I don't know if I'm making good sense right now, but the corn plant is good, but we have increased herbicide use, but we've decreased insecticide use because of the genetic modifications. And then genetically modified organisms and genetic diversity. So genetically modified crops are all genetically identical clones. So there is no diversity in the population. So that means if a disease or pest that does affect these genetically modified crops comes in, then it wipes out all of the plants. There is no chance of having a different genetic organism that can survive it. So it kills everything. If you look over here, this is non-genetically modified potatoes. So you have different genes, different diversities in these potatoes. You can see the different colors. Now, blight is a disease for potato plants that will instantly, within a week, knock them out, kill them. So if we have diverse potatoes, when this blight hits, you can see that it affects this light brown color potato, but it didn't affect these other colors. So when blight hit, the farmer lost some of his crop, but not everything, because after the blight hit, he was still left with a few potatoes. Now, if we have our cloned genetically modified potatoes, which are good because they are resistant to diseases that we know of, but if some kind of new disease or a certain type of blight that does affect these potatoes comes, then it wipes everything out because they're all genetically identical. None of them have a certain mutation or trait to allow them to survive it because they're all genetically identical. So then the farmer is left with nothing. So a practice FRQ here would be describe one economic advantage and one economic disadvantage of using genetically modified crops. And I'm going to type these up as kind of like an exit ticket, your practice FRQs. So make sure to think about, what does the word describe mean? What do I want you to write there? And on the one for 5.5, we have describe and identify again. So I will try to link that sheet where I showed you what to do for each word into Canvas so that you can look at that for that exit ticket. And I'm going to end this video, and then I will go into the next part about scientific notation.